Hi, I'm Benita.
Hi, I'm Shumon.
So today we have with us Sam. Sam is an associate professor in academic practice in the Department of Learning and Teaching Enhancement at Edinburgh Napier University, where he helps develop pedagogy across the university. He has an MA in higher education and is also a senior fellow of Higher Education Academy. His dissertation looked as how poetry can be used to improve student engagement.
He has developed and delivered a variety of different activities ranging from school assemblies and classroom visits to science fairs and poetry performances. He has also been an invited panelist, lecturer, and after dinner speaker for, among others, the Royal Meteorological Society, the British Science Association, the British Council, the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, and the Science and Technology Facilities Council. His current research involves using poetry and games to engender meaningful dialogue between scientists and non-scientists. He's a chief executive editor of the Geoscience Communication Journal and the founder of Consilience, the world's first science and poetry peer-reviewed journal. We are very proud to have you here with us, Sam.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. I'm very honoured to be asked. Thank you for that introduction as well. So my name's Sam. I am Dr. Illingworth, I guess, but Sam is absolutely fine. And at the moment, I'm an associate professor in academic practice at Edinburgh Napier University. And you've done a wonderful job of explaining my role and my research. And I suppose my journey really is that I started work after my PhD as an atmospheric physicist. And then through a succession of happy encounters and accidents, I found myself developing, I guess, a research methodology and an ethos that looks at how we can use poetry in games to help to diversify science and to make sure that science isn't just done and decided by people who look and sound like me, but rather by a truly diverse collection of people, all of whom bring diverse solutions to the global interdisciplinary problems that science presents.
That's wonderful.
It was really great to hear about your work. There's so much influence of what we see around us. Sometimes there are certain small incidents that help us figure out our inclination towards different things. Was there any particular incident when you were growing up that influenced you to choose the career path you are currently pursuing?
Wow, I don't know if I have a career path as so much a kind of loose collection of crumbs that I've stumbled upon in a forest somewhere. But I guess for me, as with many people, having pretty inspirational science teachers really helped. And people who encouraged me to think beyond the syllabus and beyond what we were being taught and to question the world and the way in which we live. And, you know, I'm a white heterosexual cis male who's pretty much the most privileged person in the world. So I've had incredible opportunities afforded to me to be able to study science, to be able to read poetry, to be able to write poetry, and to be able to meet lots of people as well. And I suppose that everybody's research direction and current work is built up of a foundation of their training, but also the encounters and opportunities that they have. So I think it would be difficult for me to point to like any one specific incident. However, after my PhD, I was really fortunate to go and live and work in Japan for a couple of years, looking at the relationship between science and theatre. And that was a very transformative experience for me. And I'd always travelled, but I think living and working abroad really helped to fundamentally change my mindset in terms of, I guess, inclusivity and in terms of experiencing a very different culture firsthand. Really helped to open my eyes to the potential of why only adopting one particular attitude towards scientific discourse is maybe not as healthy as it could be. A lot of my work works with audiences who've maybe been denied a voice or who are underserved or underheard by traditional scientific discourse and science communication. And I think it's important, I'm not championing myself here in any way, but I think it's important for people who are privileged to platform the voices of others. But again, not just because it's ethically the correct thing to do, which it is, but because you need a diversity of approaches to solve wicked problems. You know, you can look at the climate crisis, food security issues, water security issues, poverty, like food malnutrition. These are all problems that aren't going to be solved by one group of people working on ideas in a manner that's analogous to 15th century, 16th century aristocratic British people in their laboratories, right? It just doesn't work like that.
That's true.
So I think that creating a platform through which other people, which I think you do an amazing job of with your kitchen laboratory, where other people can question the world and the way in which we live, really helps to create an environment in which diverse solutions can be put forward.
You have had several shifts in your career that probably has helped you learn a diverse range of things. So what has been your biggest realization through your unique journey?
It's a really good question. Okay, so I think for me, it was probably when I first got tenure as a lecturer, and in the UK, you have to do something called a postgraduate certificate in academic practice, which is kind of like basic teacher training. And I did this, and it was mind-blowing to me because, you know, at this point I'd done a PhD and I'd gone through my entire learning without actually knowing about learning and without knowing about different mindsets and without knowing what an epistemology was, what an ontology was, what a positivist mindset was. I was very much a physicist, you know, who was test this, compare to this. So the idea of an interpretivist world in which we all create meaning that's relative to our own lived experiences was just something I'd never considered in a research way. And that was incredibly transformative for me. I had fantastic teachers as well at Manchester Metropolitan University. And I went on, as a result of this, to do a master's in higher education because I just really enjoyed it. And that has informed a lot of my future work, teaching and research and general outlook on life, really. And certainly was fundamentally important for my current role, which I guess is working in a similar academic practice team and helping other academics to think about their own learning and teaching journeys, and to support them on their process as well. So yeah, I think that's probably the most formative experience in my professional career that's helped to reframe a lot of my work today.
Looking at the trajectory that you took in your career, where you did your PhD and after that you learned about, you know, like education and all of that. So it was pretty inspirational to me because we are always thinking in terms of a linear academic career.
Again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that academia maybe funnels people down a certain route and celebrates a certain route. And we obviously can't all be PIs, right?
Yeah.
Nor should we all be PIs. I mean, they're very different skill sets. And I think that to some degree, there's challenges in every educational system at different levels as well. So, you know, one of the difficulties is in championing the learning and teaching pathway as being not equivalent, but that should be celebrated in a similar vein to a successful pure research pathway. And obviously there's people who develop learnings in each way, but I think that you're absolutely right, Saman. If you talk to, even if you talk to like hardcore physical scientists, PIs, their own trajectories are normally far from linear. And so I always find it strange that we're kind of funneled down a system that just doesn't exist.
Like us, science also goes through its ups and downs. So what do you think are the major limitations that science is currently facing, or the challenges that science is currently facing?
I think broadly speaking, one of the difficulties that science faces is misinformation. And that is not helped by the fact that science is kind of often seen as separate to the rest of society, and it's science here, society here. Whereas, in the most basic sense, if you're a scientist and you're working on the climate crisis, you're still affected by the climate crisis. If you're a scientist and you're researching cancer, you've still probably got a family member or a close friend who's lived through cancer. Like, science is part of society. And the problem is, which is sometimes through a lack of communication, sometimes through issues of politicizing, and sometimes through misinformation, that science gets separated from society, which means that even though non-scientists find scientists to be very trustworthy people, as we see from multiple studies, there's not necessarily that connection between them, and they feel very separate. And similarly, I think that sometimes there's an element of elitism. And so non-scientists are still experts and still have a lot of knowledge, lived experience, and expertise that can help to solve a lot of fundamental scientific problems. And this isn't saying, okay, let's get someone from the street to come and do like vaccination work in the laboratory. We're not saying that. What we're saying is, how can everybody's own experience, knowledge, and expertise, oral histories, indigenous knowledge, indigenous science, how can we use that and place that on a similar level to Western knowledge, to knowledge gained through going to university, etc. And I think that joining up that connection is huge. But I think by doing so, it will help to tackle issues of misinformation, which arise because people feel as though they are not connected between science and society. So they go to alternative means of communication for their information.
So challenges makes us learn better. What were the major challenges that you have faced in your journey?
I think with all challenges, I think it's really important to introduce an element of perspective. And I think I've been quite fortunate with a lot of my career. Things have happened at the right time, or the right jobs come up at the same time, or the right mentors come up. I think one of the challenges I probably face or have faced is in convincing people that what I'm doing has, I guess, academic integrity. Well, not even integrity, but that it's to be taken seriously. So oftentimes when you tell people that, your work is around poetry and games, like, a lot of people think that's cool, and a lot of non-scientists think, okay, that's maybe a great way of engaging science with, but it can be sometimes quite difficult convincing colleagues and others that what I do has a lot of research behind it, has a lot of method behind it, and that even though I approach things in a very different way to when I was a PhD student and an undergraduate doing physics and space science, it's still as academically integral and uses a lot of very tried and tested and developing methodologies as well. But to some extent, I don't really care. Like, obviously it's annoying when people think that, but I see what the results are and I see that it's having a positive impact. So I think that that's fine. So I don't mean, aside from the regular difficulties that I guess a lot of people have, I don't feel as though in my professional career I've come across too many. I guess I'm quite an optimistic person as well there, so maybe it's that.
So though we might learn a lot from our failures, but it's not easy to deal with them. So how do you deal with your failures?
Okay, so that's a really good question. I do a lot of reflecting. So again, I think when I was doing my training in education, I was introduced to like formal models of reflection, for example, like Gibbs's model of reflection. Mm-hmm. And obviously as scientists, you do a lot of reflecting anyway, like naturally, like this, I did this experiment, like I changed this variable, this was the result, what do I need to change to get better, etc. But having a formal model and then using that to reflect on my own experiences in teaching, in research, in practice has really, really helped. So a lot of the things I do fail, but what does failure mean? You know, if we do an experiment and we get a result we're not expecting, it doesn't necessarily mean it's failed. It just means we've got another result, and then we can learn from that and develop the experiment further. And I think it's the same with anything. Like if you try something and it doesn't work, but you're able to reflect in a meaningful way on why it didn't work, how that made you feel, how you could do things differently next time, then I think that it can be a really positive learning experience as well. And I really think that people should be encouraged strongly to try many, many different things, and not to think of things as failures, but just to think of them as, I guess, data points along the way of discovery.
It's a beautiful philosophy. The main problem with our society is often that we are not learned how to cope with failures. We are always pushed to this idea that we have to succeed and no matter what. It's a rat race and you have to survive. I mean, that's the kind of mentality that a lot of people grow up with, and that is the problem why sometimes it is a very difficult situation for us to cope up with failures because of lack of reflection.
And I think as well that definition of success, right? Like, what does success look like? And I think that's made even harder by, I mean, I'm a strong proponent of social media, but I think a lot of the times you see people's front office and not their back office. So you often see people's successes, but you don't see you'll see someone's grant success. You won't see the 30 applications they put in that were unsuccessful beforehand. And I think that's really important. And I think it's, I know that sounds incredibly trite, but if you're doing something that has a positive impact on your surroundings and makes you happy, and you're able to, and does so in a way that enables you to live, I think that's incredibly successful. And I think that exactly like you say, Saman, like because of a lack of reflection and impossible goals that are held up for us, that I mean, when we look at science, we're just always presented with pictures of like Newton and Einstein and Marie Curie.
That's right.
They're completely unrealistic role models. Completely unrealistic.
Yeah, true.
But we think about people in our own place of work who, aren't even professors or aren't even lecturers. There's so many people who are incredibly inspirational that we work with on a daily basis that aren't scientists as well, and who I think we should hold up as far more important role models. I mean, look at the work that you're doing. I mean, having 5 people in a kitchen to talk about chemistry and to give them the empowerment that they need to question the society in which they live has unbelievable repercussions. And what's more impactful, that or having a publication in Nature? Right? I think that success is such a difficult word. So like with Consilience, which is the science and poetry journal that you mentioned, and artwork, we really wanted to create a space that encouraged people to explore the shadow space between the sciences and the arts, but move away from this idea that you have to be an incredible poet or an incredible artist in order to have your work published. And what does incredible mean? And that actually what we want is to create a community where people can be supported in exploring and in celebrating and in sharing. And I think that sense of community is actually what science can bring a lot of the times, exactly as you've demonstrated. And I think that, my favorite thing about my work is collaborating. And I absolutely love it. And I get into a lot of trouble because I say yes to almost everything. But I just think it leads to so many amazing opportunities of meeting people. So there's a quote by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's the Austrian philosopher, who he says, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." And I just think it's a phenomenal quote. Like, it's just amazing. Like not even like just spoken language.
Mhm.
And one of my many failings is that I'm not really proficient in any language apart from English, but just the ability to be able to learn how others speak in their disciplines and in their life worlds. And the more people we meet, the more diversity we have, the more ways of looking at a problem we have, and the greater our understanding and knowledge becomes. And I think that's a really, again, not to sound trite, but I think that's a really beautiful thing that is really powerful.
True, very true. So you are interested in science, poetry, and games. Do you think that there are points where they intersect, and which are the major points of intersection?
The way that they intersect is maybe not the way you think, in that poetry and games are actually afford a real opportunity to help diversify science, but they also come with their own difficulties, in that poetry, less so spoken word, but written poetry, and analog games also have an element of exclusivity towards them. And, you know, we can see that written poetry in the West tends to be dominated by a certain person who also might dominate games, who also might dominate science. So one of the similar, and people always say this to me, they say, Sam, why are you trying to diversify science by using a medium which itself maybe has issues with diversity? And it's a very good question, but I think it affords a real opportunity. Like, so with poetry, for example, one of the problems is that I think people feel excluded from poetry because they've only been introduced to a very specific type of poetry. And that type of poetry is poetry that maybe people have been introduced to in school, and that might have a very Eurocentric flavor to it, and that might be written by dead white men who have an opinion that is maybe not particularly relevant. However, if we work with a community and identify poetry that speaks for them and by them, then there's this realization that poetry is this incredibly powerful way of vocalizing, reflecting, making sense of the world around us. And that by doing so, we can then use that to also question science and to act as a lens. But it's really important that the way we do that is by first working with that audience to understand their needs, their backgrounds, their heritage. And for me, I love doing that because I enjoy working a lot of the time in where English isn't the first language, and that's fine. And listening to poetry that I don't understand, but which has a rhythm to it and a sound which is beautiful. You know, I think Persian poetry will always be my favorite poetry, even though I really don't understand what it's saying. Just the way that it sounds is beautiful. Like Portuguese poetry as well, like the Fado is gorgeous. And I think that opportunity of realizing that there is limitations with diversity, but really finding what people's interests are, and then using that as a hook to get them into poetry, and then using that as a way of bringing them into science as well.
So as you said, we were exposed to art before we studied science, actually, but we have learned poems before texts. So was it your childhood that had impacted on you, or was it something you practiced and developed over time?
When I was at school, I was always like very good at science and maths, and you know, I wanted to do physics, and the British education system is very good, but it's kind of, you have to go down a path in order to do your exams, in order to do this degree that you want to do at university. So to some extent, at kind of around 14, 15, you need to decide what your future career trajectory is going to be. So I'd always written poetry, and you know, I was in a band at school, and I liked writing music, but I think that I was unable to do art alongside science. But then I just did it in my spare time, and then what I've kind of forced through is an opportunity to combine the two, where I think there's been the chance to do so. So yeah, I think it's probably out of necessity for my own mental well-being as well. Although the difficulty with that, as I'm sure you're both aware, is doing something that you love. Work-life boundaries sometimes become difficult, and can merge a little too much, I think.
So creative writing might come naturally to a few, but perfection can be achieved with proper mentorship. So do you conduct workshops, especially, in training people who are new to creative writing?
Yeah, so I have a workshop that I've run for several thousand people now, I think, which is about like how to turn your research into poetry. But I've also done lots of writing workshops, and I'm always available to run those as well, because I think it's about, like, for me, sometimes there's a danger with poetry, as with science, that there's a bit of snobbishness or elitism in what's considered to be aesthetically pleasing. But I don't think that's what poetry is about all the time. I think writing something that enables you to reflect and contextualize an issue is an incredibly powerful learning experience, in like the truest sense of learning. And I think that running workshops to help people. A lot of the workshops I write, I'm around getting people comfortable with poetry. Not even like, this is what a great poem looks like, this is what you should aspire to, but bring poetry into your life, like read poetry, like think about poetry, write poetry. And there's many ways of doing that. So I think that, again, just trying to lower the barrier to entry so that everyone can have poetry in their lives is really important. I don't think I'm a particularly good poet, but I do write a lot of poems, and poetry forms a large part of my life. So I do tend to, this sounds very strange, but I tend to see things poetically, if that makes sense. Like, so I find it easy, not necessarily to write good poetry, but to write poetry in a reflective sense very rapidly about anything, because I just the amount of poetry I've written and the amount of success I've exposed to it, that's the lens through which I tend to see the world, I think.
Although art is subjective and the success of any art lies in its varied interpretation, what are the components you try to bring out in your poems? Like, when do you feel content with it?
Okay, so I'm writing a textbook at the moment for Spring and Nature on science communication through poetry. And one of the things in that is I talk about like defining what is poetry. And there's many different definitions, okay, by people much more learned than me. But for me, poetry has rhythm. That's it. Like, if something you read has rhythm, then it's a poem. And I think I'm pretty good at, probably too good at, knowing when something's finished and not trying to perfect it. But what I always try to do is make sure something has rhythm, because if it's got rhythm, it's a poem.
So what is the key feature that you take into account while designing science games? And what is the current reach and popularity of science games?
For me, the most important thing to take into account is the audience, right? It's who's going to be playing this and what are the restrictions that they have. So, for example, like, what's the affordability? What playing space do they have? How much time can they afford? What's their gaming literacy? They're really important, but those constraints can then help you to be really creative. So I think finding out about the audience, what those constraints are, and then using that as a framework through which to make the games really important. How popular are science games? How important are they? I think talking about analog games now, so tabletop games, board games, cards games, role-playing games, like the whole industry is having an incredible renaissance at the moment. And I think that there's a lot of work and research and lots of people doing cool stuff and innovative stuff around using science games. So I think it's never been as exciting and as successful as it is now.
So how do you keep yourself motivated?
Everyone has days where they feel as though what they're doing is completely pointless and worthless, and sense of rejection. But then I think you'll get an email or a message from someone, like a colleague or a student or a friend, and it just completely helps to validate what you're doing, right? And that's why whenever I can, I always try to do the same. If someone does something great, I'll just message them, because I have like a stored file of those messages that I just look at when I'm feeling a bit low, and they really help.
Yeah.
What would be your message to our young audience who have interest in similar lines as you?
What my message would be is to, I guess the best advice I can give, right, is to be as creative as possible, to not try to limit yourself but also to be pragmatic. Like, I think that's really important. So again, I'm speaking from a position of privilege where I have a secure job, where I'm relatively well paid, and where there's a degree in there's an element of experimentation that's allowed in my work. But in order to do that, there's still other things that have to be done as well. So I think that creating something that enables you to be creative and that enables you to explore the things that you want to do, whilst also being very pragmatic about putting food on the table, supporting your family, etc., is really, really important. And that's not to say that it stops you from doing that, but just thinking, how can you create your own world so that that side of things is sewn up, and then you are afforded space to experiment with your own creativity.
Coming to the last question, what do you think about Kitchen Lab?
I think it's an amazing initiative. I think it's, grassroots science at its best. I think it's super inclusive. I really like the way that it uses, I think it uses real indigenous knowledge and local expertise as well. So this idea of like the chemicals, etc., not being chemicals that are harmful, but rather that are part of like cultural knowledge as well is amazing. And I think creating a space that enables that discussion and which has such great role models such as yourself and Suman is really, really important and vital for those communities. And again, just the opportunity to question and to make sense of the world is an incredibly powerful gift that you can give people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Stay safe, both.